The morning of June 8th, 1944, broke over Normandy like the slow opening of a curtain after a night of thunder. The mist clung low to the hedgerows, heavy with the smell of salt and fuel, carrying the echo of engines that had never stopped since the landings 2 days earlier. Across the fields, German tank crews stirred inside their machines, yawning into the stale air that reeked of oil and sweat. They were veterans of Russia, of Africa, men hardened by years of victory, and as they peered through periscopes toward the faint movement on the far ridge, they allowed themselves a laugh. In the hazy distance, the silhouettes of Allied tanks were advancing again, those boxy shapes they knew too well, the dependable but hopelessly and undergunned Shermans. A young gunner inside a Panther smirked and muttered, "More cooking pots." The others chuckled. They had seen this play before, the Allies pushing forward in their endless numbers, and the German guns cutting them down before they came within reach. To them, the outcome felt predetermined, a grim arithmetic of range, armor, and precision that always ended the same way. But that morning, something was different. The Allied column that moved through the orchards below was British, and among its ranks rolled a tank that looked almost the same as the others. Almost. Its gun was longer, its barrel stretching forward like a spear that refused to end. Inside, 5 men sat in a silence born not of fear, but of anticipation. Their commander, Lieutenant John Irving of the 13th 18th Royal Hussars, had been briefed the night before. This mission would mark the first combat use of a new weapon. He had been told to expect skepticism from his own men, but also that once it fired, there would be no more need for persuasion. Through the narrow sight of his periscope, Irving could see the shimmer of armor in the distance. Panthers, at least 3 of them, hulls turned slightly to the flank, guns already elevated. He could imagine the laughter inside those German turrets, the practiced confidence that came from months of hunting Allied tanks at will. He took a slow breath, steadying himself against the vibration of the idling engine. "Steady, lads," he said quietly. When the first German shell whistled overhead and exploded in the field behind them, the Firefly's gunner did not flinch. He had already found his range. The commander's voice cut through the intercom. "On the lead, Panther! Fire!" The shot cracked like thunder. A bright muzzle flash illuminated the hedgerow, and a shell the size of a man's arm tore across the valley at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It struck the Panther's frontal armor squarely, and to the astonishment of every man who saw it, the German tank erupted. The round pierced the glacis, ricocheted inside the turret, and detonated the ammunition racks. For a second, the explosion was silent. Then, the turret lifted clear of the hull in a cloud of flame and debris. The laughter stopped. The remaining Panthers froze, unsure what had happened. The British gunner reloaded. His hands moved automatically. Breech open, shell in, breech closed. The rhythm of months of training. A second flash, a second kill. 2 Panthers burning, the third reversing frantically into the tree line. The radio crackled with astonished voices. What in God's name was that gun? From the ridge above, German observers reported seeing what they described as a Sherman with an impossibly long barrel. Within hours, the report reached divisional command. New enemy tank, heavy armament, extreme penetration. They didn't yet know the name. The British did. They called it the Sherman Firefly. As the smoke settled over Normandy's bocage, one truth became clear to every German tanker still alive on that field. The era of laughing at Allied tanks was over. In a war defined by machines, fear shifted not with numbers, but with distance. The moment the Firefly fired its first shot, the psychological balance of armored warfare in Western Europe began to tilt slowly, inexorably toward the Allies. Long before the Firefly appeared, the Sherman was already the most recognizable tank in the world. It rolled off American assembly lines by the thousands, a symbol of industrial might and mechanical dependability. To the soldiers who drove it, the Sherman was a faithful companion, simple, reliable, and easy to repair. But to those who fought against it, especially the veterans of the Panzer divisions, it was little more than a moving target. The German nickname for the Sherman came quickly and cruelly: Tommy Cooker. The name referred to how easily its gasoline engine ignited when hit, turning the tank into a deadly furnace for its crew. To many German gunners, spotting a Sherman meant another easy victory, another plume of smoke rising over the battlefield. And for a time, that assessment was not entirely wrong. In North Africa, the Sherman had first gone up against the seasoned tankers of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Its 75mm gun, adequate against earlier Panzer models, struggled against the newer German designs that began appearing by late 1942. The lessons learned in the desert were harsh and unforgettable. Allied tankers discovered that bravery and numbers could not always overcome range and precision. The German 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at twice the distance the Sherman could reply. The same pattern repeated in Italy and later in Normandy. The Sherman's design philosophy, built around mobility and mass production, was colliding head-on with the German obsession for firepower and armor. German crews trusted their machines. The Tiger, with its thick hide and devastating gun, inspired awe and confidence. The Panther, sleek and fast, carried the aura of invincibility. Against such opponents, the Sherman looked crude and outdated. But what the Germans did not yet understand was that the Sherman's simplicity was its greatest strength. It could break down and be repaired within hours. Engines could be swapped in the field. Tracks could be replaced without specialized tools. Every Sherman shared the same basic components, meaning that parts from one could resurrect another. The Allied armies had built not a perfect machine, but a sustainable one. Still, to the men who had to drive them into battle, those advantages meant little when a German shell came screaming toward them from over a mile away. The psychological toll was immense. Tank crews often went into combat knowing they could be destroyed before ever seeing their enemy. Reports from Normandy described Shermans knocked out by invisible foes firing from beyond the hedgerows. Survivors spoke of the sound of German guns: sharp, mechanical, final. The Allied command recognized this imbalance and knew something had to change. A tank that could win through numbers was not enough. They needed a weapon that could stand on equal ground with the Tiger and Panther. And if such a weapon could not be designed from scratch, it would have to be created from what already existed. In Britain, engineers began looking at the Sherman's sturdy chassis with new eyes. It might not have been designed for a large gun, but perhaps it could carry one. Across workshops and proving grounds, ordnance specialists debated the impossible, mounting the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, one of the most powerful weapons in the Allied arsenal, inside the cramped turret of the American tank. Most dismissed it as fantasy. The 17-pounder was massive, with a recoil so violent that it threatened to tear smaller mounts apart. The Sherman's turret simply wasn't built for it. But the idea refused to die. Necessity, after all, is the engineer's greatest inspiration. By the end of 1943, a small group of British technicians was quietly working to make the impossible real. They had no grand factory, no massive budget, and no certainty that their project would even succeed. What they did have was desperation, and a clear understanding that without a gun capable of matching the Tiger, their crews would keep dying in tanks that the enemy still laughed at. That laughter would soon end, though not because of American innovation or new manufacturing miracles. It would end because a handful of British engineers decided that if no one would give them the weapon they needed, they would build it themselves. In the winter of 1943, far from the roar of the front lines, the sound of hammers and cutting torches echoed through a dimly lit workshop somewhere in southern England. Outside, the air was cold and damp, filled with the low rumble of passing aircraft and the distant whistle of trains hauling supplies toward the coast. Inside, among the clutter of spare parts and welded steel, a group of British engineers were attempting something few believed possible, uh, to turn an ordinary Sherman into a tank killer. The challenge was daunting. The British already possessed the 17-pounder, a weapon capable of piercing even the heaviest German armor. It was long, powerful, and accurate, a masterpiece of gunnery design. But its size was its curse. The gun's breech block was massive, its recoil enormous, and the shell it fired was nearly 3 feet long. Trying to fit such a weapon into the Sherman's small turret seemed absurd. Every inch of space inside that turret was already accounted for. There was barely room for 3 men, the gunner, loader, and commander, all surrounded by ammunition racks, radios, and control levers. Installing the 17-pounder would mean tearing everything apart and rebuilding it from the inside out. Most British officers dismissed the idea immediately. "You'll never fit that bloody gun in there," one colonel reportedly said. But the men in that workshop weren't interested in what couldn't be done. They had seen what the Germans were fielding. Tigers that shrugged off everything the Allies fired, Panthers whose guns could tear through a Sherman from 2 kilometers away. They knew that without a breakthrough, every Allied advance would remain a slaughter. So they began to improvise. First, they removed the gun's standard breech and reoriented it sideways to reduce its height. Then they modified the recoil system, replacing the original buffer with a shortened, high-pressure variant. The recoil length was reduced from nearly 40 inches to just under 30. It was still brutal, but it might just fit. Next came the problem of balance. The 17-pounder's barrel was so long that it threatened to unbalance the entire turret. To counter this, engineers installed a massive counterweight at the rear, a solid steel box that would later double as ammunition storage. The tank's radio, normally mounted inside the turret, was moved to a new compartment at the back of this counterweight. That relocation became one of the Firefly's most distinctive features, a bulging rear box that gave its turret an unmistakable profile. By early 1944, the first prototype was ready. It looked ungainly, almost comical, a Sherman with a barrel nearly twice as long as the hull itself. But when the test firing began, no one was laughing. The 17-pounder's first round screamed downrange, shattering the still air. The recoil shook the tank violently, the echo rolling across the field like thunder. At the far end of the range, a plate of hardened armor nearly 5 inches thick was struck dead center. The shell tore through it and continued another 100 meters before embedding itself in a sandbank. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of engineers exhaling in disbelief. The second shot repeated the result. Then the third. Every round penetrated with ease. When they placed a captured piece of German Panther armor at the target line, the results were the same. Clean holes punched straight through steel that Allied tankers had once considered invincible. The men watching that day knew what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a technical success. It was a turning point. The Allies finally had a weapon that could stand toe-to-toe with Germany's best. Word spread quickly through the British ordnance community. The weaponized Sherman received a code name, Firefly. Officially, it was still a modified M4, but its new identity spread faster than bureaucracy could contain it. The name suited it perfectly. Bright, fast, and deadly in the dark. Crews who saw it for the first time had mixed reactions. Some thought it looked ridiculous, others called it beautiful. But every man who fired it knew that at last they could fight on equal terms. In February 1944, the first conversions were authorized for production. Workshops across Britain began transforming ordinary Shermans into Fireflies. The process was laborious. Each tank required weeks of modification, but the urgency was absolute. In less than 6 months, hundreds of Fireflies would be ready to cross the channel. What had begun as a desperate experiment was now an instrument of war. As one engineer wrote in his diary that winter, "We have given our lads a chance, the rest will be up to them." The laughter of the German tank crews still echoed across Europe. But deep in those British workshops, the answer to that laughter was being built, one long, slender barrel at a time. By the spring of 1944, the new creation had begun to take shape in numbers that mattered. In small British factories, crews worked around the clock, cutting open Sherman turrets, installing new recoil cylinders, and fitting the massive 17-pounder gun with care that bordered on reverence. The air smelled of oil and welding smoke. Every tank that left the workshop looked the same at first glance. Olive drab paint, rounded hull, familiar American lines, but that long, predatory barrel told another story. The Firefly had been born not in the drawing rooms of generals, but in the hands of mechanics, engineers, and field soldiers who knew exactly what it was like to stare down a tiger's barrel. It was a weapon forged from necessity rather than perfection. The men who built it knew they weren't creating the most balanced tank, or even the most comfortable, but they didn't care. What they wanted was a machine that could kill the enemy before the enemy killed them. When the first production Fireflies rolled onto the test fields in southern England, observers gathered in quiet anticipation. Military officials from the War Office, ordnance inspectors, and senior tank commanders stood shoulder to shoulder, notebooks ready. The demonstration began with the familiar clatter of tracks as a Firefly rumbled into position. Its crew of 5 moved efficiently inside the cramped turret, adjusting to the limited space and the smell of fresh paint and oil. The first target was set at 1,000 yards, a section of captured Panther armor welded to a heavy steel frame. The gunner aligned to the sight, whispered the range, and pressed the firing pedal. The sound was thunderous, far louder than any standard Sherman 75mm gun. The shell struck the plate with a flash and a heavy metallic thud. When the smoke cleared, the observers saw daylight through the armor. At 1,500 yards, the result was the same. Then 2,000. The penetrations were clean, the energy overwhelming. The report that followed described it simply: complete success, target rendered useless, Firefly performance exceeds expectations. But success came with compromise. The gun's length made it difficult to maneuver in tight spaces. The recoil was so fierce that the tank shook violently after each shot, rattling the nerves of any crew unaccustomed to it. The loader's job became a test of endurance. The 17-pounder shells were heavy, awkward, and nearly impossible to handle in the confined turret. Yet for all those difficulties, there was no denying what this machine could do. For the first time since 1940, Allied tankers had a weapon that could kill a German heavy tank head-on. Crews began receiving their new mounts in the weeks before D-Day. They trained quietly on the English countryside, far from prying eyes. The secrecy surrounding the Firefly was total. Intelligence officers feared that if the Germans learned of the new tank's existence, they would change tactics or strengthen their armor before the invasion. Orders were clear: no photographs, no public mention, no discussion outside authorized briefings. To keep the Firefly hidden, the long barrel was disguised with paint and canvas to make it appear shorter. Some units used creative tricks, wrapping the front portion of the barrel with strips of cloth and painting them in camouflage patterns, fooling enemy observers into thinking it was just another standard Sherman. The crews themselves became fiercely protective of their new weapon. They practiced gunnery for hours each day, testing accuracy, learning how to fire and relocate before the enemy could spot them. The tank commanders studied every known weakness in German armor. They memorized the range at which a Tiger could be penetrated, the angles that offered the best shot at a Panther's turret. Knowledge, they knew, was survival. Yet not everyone was convinced. Many Allied officers remained skeptical that a modified Sherman could truly change the battlefield. They remembered the early disasters of North Africa and the stories of Shermans bursting into flame after a single hit. To them, The Firefly was an experiment, impressive on paper, but unproven in war. That proof would come soon enough. As May turned to June, the invasion of Normandy drew near. In southern England, thousands of tanks lined up in endless rows, waiting for their turn to cross the channel. Among them, a small but growing number of Fireflies sat under tarps, their barrels concealed, their crews restless. They didn't know it yet, but within weeks, those long guns would be aimed across the hedgerows of France. They would meet the German Tigers and Panthers face to face, and in those brief, terrible moments, history would remember their work. The laughter that had followed the Shermans since North Africa was about to end forever. In the weeks before D-Day, the English countryside transformed into a vast armored camp. Narrow lanes once filled with shepherds and farm carts now thundered under the weight of thousands of tanks and trucks. Rows of Shermans stretched across open fields, their crews sleeping in tents beside them, engines idling at dawn to keep oil warm against the chill air. Among the endless ranks of ordinary Shermans sat a few that looked different, longer, leaner, and far deadlier. The Fireflies had arrived quietly, under orders that bordered on secrecy. Each regiment received only a handful, one or two per troop at most. They were treated as precious assets, to be used sparingly and guarded carefully. Only the most experienced gunners and commanders were selected to operate them. Before being issued, each man was briefed privately. No photographs, no boasting, no mention of the weapon's true range or power. The idea was simple: surprise. The Germans knew the Shermans' limitations and had built their confidence around them. If they expected weakness, the Allies would give them shock instead. The Firefly's presence would remain hidden until the first shot was fired in anger. For the men who received them, it was like being handed a secret too powerful to share. Tankers who had fought through Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy stared at the long barrel with disbelief. For years, they had faced German armor, knowing that even the bravest maneuver could end in a single flash of enemy fire. Now they had something that could strike back. During training, the Firefly quickly earned a reputation among its crews. The gun was brutally loud, the recoil fierce, the interior cramped beyond reason. The loader's job became almost impossible in the heat of battle, his arms straining to handle shells nearly a meter long. But for every complaint, there was equal pride. Crews learned to work in rhythm, shouting over the deafening roar, their bodies synchronized like machinery. On the firing ranges, scattered across Wiltshire and Dorset, Fireflies practiced shooting at captured German armor. Targets painted with the black crosses of the Wehrmacht stood at distances unheard of in Allied gunnery. At 1.5 kilometers, the 17-pounder shells sliced through the steel like paper. Commanders who had doubted its usefulness were suddenly silent. The weapon did not just match the German guns, it surpassed them. Still, there was a sense of unease. The Firefly was a powerful but rare tool, and its presence had to be protected. The Germans had spies, and Allied intelligence knew it. Every precaution was taken. Tanks were moved under cover of darkness, transported by rail with barrels shrouded in tarpaulin. Even some Allied soldiers who saw them up close didn't know what they were looking at. In May, the 21st Army Group began final preparations for Operation Overlord. Fireflies were assigned across British and Canadian armored divisions. Each troop of 4 tanks would include 1 Firefly, the others standard Shermans. It was a delicate balance. The Firefly would serve as the long-range killer, while the regular Shermans provided mobility and support. Together, they would form a single, flexible fighting unit. Crews practiced coordination endlessly. When advancing, the Firefly would stay slightly behind, using its greater range to engage enemy armor before the rest closed in. When ambushed, it would target the heaviest threat, the Tiger, the Panther, or the fortified gun position, while the other tanks flanked or withdrew. The new doctrine demanded precision, communication, and trust. For the men training under the cloudy English sky, The coming invasion was no longer an abstraction. They could feel it in the restless movement of convoys, the hum of aircraft, the endless speeches about courage and sacrifice. But behind the stoic calm, every Firefly crew knew they carried something the enemy wasn't expecting. A few weeks before D-Day, a German reconnaissance aircraft flew over southern England on a rare, clear morning. The pilot reported seeing vast formations of tanks gathering near the coast, thousands of Shermans glinting in the sun. But when intelligence officers examined the photographs, they saw nothing unusual. The barrels all looked short, the same old Shermans they'd fought for years. The deception had worked. In those last quiet nights before the invasion, as rain fell softly on the canvas tents and the engines cooled to silence, crews sat together by lantern light, cleaning their guns one last time. The veterans joked that soon they would be back in France again, this time as liberators. The younger men listened, their faces lit by the glow of cigarette embers. None of them could have known what waited on the other side of the channel. Fields thick with mud, hedgerows that swallowed tanks whole, and an enemy whose armor still ruled every open plain. But the Firefly crews carried a quiet confidence the others did not. They had seen what their gun could do, and they believed in it. When the orders finally came to move toward the ports, the Fireflies rolled through the darkness without headlights, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Their barrels were still wrapped in canvas, their identities still hidden. But beneath that cover, the balance of armored warfare was about to change. The invasion of Normandy would test every weapon the Allies had. And for the Firefly, it would be the moment of truth. When dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the horizon was thick with smoke and the thunder of artillery. The invasion had begun, and with it came the largest amphibious assault in history. Waves of landing craft carried men, trucks, and tanks toward the coast, fighting through the chaos of surf and gunfire. Among them, tucked deep in the holds of landing ships, were the first Fireflies, silent, untested, and waiting. 2 days later, they rolled ashore. Their tracks bit into the sand as they crawled up from the beaches, engines growling under the strain. The British 7th Armored Division and the Canadian 2nd Armored Brigade received their Fireflies first. Their arrival went almost unnoticed amid the frenzy of unloading and organizing. But those who looked closely saw the difference. The barrels were longer, the crews more deliberate in their movements. They knew they carried something special. The bocage country of Normandy was unlike anything Allied tankers had imagined. High hedgerows, narrow lanes, and hidden ditches turned every engagement into a close-quarters fight. Tanks could disappear within a few meters of each other, ambushes waiting at every turn. It was terrain that favored defense, and the Germans knew it well. Panthers and Tigers waited in concealed positions, their guns covering fields and crossroads. Every advance was a gamble. For days, the Shermans pushed inland, suffering heavy losses. German gunners waited until the Allied columns were within range, then struck with brutal precision. A single Tiger could halt an entire advance, its shells ripping through the multiple tanks in seconds. The men began to dread the sight of the long German barrels peeking through the hedgerows. Then, in early July, near a small village called Villers-Bocage, the Firefly earned its name. The British 4th County of London Yeomanry had been ordered to support an advance toward the town. Unknown to them, the German 101st Heavy SS Panzer Battalion had taken up positions nearby, commanded by one of the most feared tank aces of the war, Michael Whitman. In the morning mist, his Tigers struck first, tearing through the column and leaving burning wrecks scattered across the fields. For a moment, it seemed another disaster in the making. But later that day, as the Germans regrouped to press the advantage, a lone Firefly from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry took up a hidden position on a ridge overlooking the road. Its commander, Sergeant Gordon, watched through his binoculars as a line of German tanks moved cautiously below. He could see the crosses painted on their hulls, the unmistakable bulk of a Tiger in the lead. At 800 meters, the Firefly's gunner found his range. The command was simple: fire! The shell struck the Tiger dead center, piercing the armor and igniting its ammunition. The explosion was immediate and violent, the turret thrown from the hull. Two more rounds followed in rapid succession, destroying the tanks behind it. When the smoke cleared, the road was a graveyard. German reports later confirmed that Michael Wittmann's Tiger had been destroyed that day by a 17-pounder gun, most likely from a Firefly. The news rippled through both armies. To the Germans, it was a shock. The Allies had never before possessed a tank that could kill a Tiger at range. To the British and Canadians, it was vindication. The Firefly had proven itself. In the weeks that followed, more Fireflies reached the front. Their effect was immediate and unmistakable. German crews, who once mocked the Sherman, began scanning every battlefield for that long barrel. They learned to target Fireflies first, recognizing the threat they posed. British crews adapted quickly, hiding their Fireflies among standard Shermans to conceal them from enemy observation. Some even painted the forward section of the barrel a lighter color to make it appear shorter at a glance. The psychological balance was shifting. German tankers, once certain of their superiority, began to hesitate. Reports from the front described Panthers destroyed at unexpected ranges, Tigers knocked out from positions they believed safe. Commanders demanded to know what new weapon the Allies had unleashed. In truth, the Firefly was still just a modified Sherman, thinly armored, underpowered, and vulnerable if caught in the open. But its gun changed everything. With the 17-pounder, the Allies could now fight at distances that once belonged solely to the Germans. The battlefield no longer felt like an execution ground, it had become a contest again. At the height of the Normandy campaign, Fireflies were credited with dozens of kills against German armor. In one engagement near Caen, a troop of 3 Fireflies ambushed a German column, destroying 5 Panthers before they could return fire. Another report from the Canadian 1st Hussars described a Firefly knocking out a Tiger II, the infamous King Tiger, at nearly 1,500 yards. The results were undeniable. The British had taken an ordinary tank and turned it into a weapon of precision and fear. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the Firefly's legend grew. German radio intercepts began referring to them as Feuerkäfer, fire beetles. They were to be hunted and destroyed at all costs. But even as German orders grew more desperate, their tanks were burning faster than they could be replaced. The laughter that had once greeted the Sherman had turned into silence, replaced by the dull echo of German crews asking the same question again and again. What is that gun? The sudden appearance of a new long-range threat forced commanders on both sides to rethink how they fought. For the British, the change was pragmatic and fast. Fireflies could not replace Shermans. They were too rare, too awkward, and too fragile in close quarters. But paired with regular Shermans, they created a complementary system that exploited strengths and masked weaknesses. Mixed troops became the norm. 1 Firefly to provide overwatch, 3 Shermans to close, scout, and protect. The doctrine was simple in principle and subtle in execution. The Firefly watched the fields and hedgerows from concealed positions, engaging high-value targets at distance. The Shermans maneuvered, screened, and drew fire when necessary. Together they turned a previously hopeless meeting engagement into a coordinated operation. Training shifted to reflect that new reality. Tank commanders practiced communication drills until they were ingrained. How the Firefly would call targets, how the Shermans would feed targets into its sights, and how the entire troop would break contact after the Firefly fired to avoid counter-battery. Radio discipline became a weapon of its own. A single, careless transmission could give away the Firefly's position. Crews practiced rapid displacement, learning to shoot once and relocate before enemy observers could triangulate their range. These techniques turned the Firefly into a ghostly presence on the battlefield. a killer who struck and vanished before the enemy could reply. Camouflage and deception became central to survival. Crews learned to mask the Firefly's silhouette by parking it among regular Shermans and obscuring the barrel with foliage or canvas. Some units painted the last meter of barrel with disruptive patterns. Others improvised false muzzle brakes to mimic the standard Sherman gun. Night movements, silent idling, and clever positioning behind slight rises allowed Fireflies to fire without revealing the source. Those who mastered this tradecraft lived longer and scored more kills. Those who did not became statistics in the morning reports. Tactics also evolved at the platoon and battalion level. Fireflies were assigned to tasks that maximized their range advantage, overwatching roads, covering river fords, and holding dominating terrain. When an armored push was expected, commanders placed a Firefly on the crest of a ridge or at a concealed bend in a road where it could observe the enemy's approach long before the rest of the formation engaged. Spotters and forward observers became the Firefly's eyes, relaying range and bearing information that allowed gunners to dial in accuracy at extreme distances. At a larger scale, combined arms doctrine absorbed the Firefly's capabilities into operational planning. Artillery, infantry, and tanks worked in closer concert. Artillery suppressed known enemy anti-tank positions, while infantry sealed flanks. Air reconnaissance fed real-time reports into headquarters, identifying likely corridors of enemy movement where Fireflies could be pre-positioned. The result was a more deliberate, layered defense that turned German advances into funnels of death. Rather than rushing blindly into the open, German armor found itself facing prepared killing zones, where the first volley often determined the engagement's outcome. German forces reacted predictably and rapidly. Once they identified the Firefly as a specific threat, orders followed to seek and destroy it. Reconnaissance patrols scanned hedgerows and ridgelines for the telltale long barrel, and anti-tank guns were redeployed to cover the likely approaches. Luftwaffe reconnaissance prioritized snapping photographs of suspected positions. Snipers and infantry were assigned to probe and flush Fireflies out of hiding. Teams developed search patterns where one unit would deliberately bait an engagement, drawing enemy fire while an anti-tank element attempted to catch the shooter exposed. This tactical cat-and-mouse shaped many engagements. In one recorded action outside Caen, German crews coordinated a counter-ambush. A reconnaissance Sherman drove ahead to draw the Firefly, while concealed Panthers lay in wait to punch through flanking positions. The Firefly's crew, trained to recognize the pattern, fired on the Panthers at once and then relocated, avoiding the trap. 2 hours later, the same Panthers returned with better coordination. This time, the Firefly, having exhausted its ready ammunition, could not prevent a close flanking assault. The lesson was brutal and immediate. Fireflies could dominate at range, but if trapped at short distance without support, they could be destroyed as easily as any Sherman. Logistics and resupply had to adapt as well. The 17-pounder's ammunition was bulkier and heavier than standard St. Sherman rounds, requiring special handling and reduced onboard stowage. Supply convoys carried fewer rounds per vehicle, and ammunition discipline on the battlefield became crucial. Commanders had to balance the temptation to engage high-value targets from long range against the risk of depleting precious stocks. Crews practiced economizing shots, deliberate, well-considered fire rather than rapid, wasteful barrages. The paradox was clear. A gun of overwhelming power demanded the most careful restraint. Leadership at the company and battalion levels embraced the Firefly's limitations and strengths, building doctrine that emphasized synergy. A recommended tactic became standard. Identify the enemy's heaviest tank with forward scouts, bring the Firefly into a concealed overwatch position, let regular Shermans close and pin the enemy's flanks and deliver finishing shots from a distance. The psychological impact was reinforced by discipline. Squads that followed procedure experienced higher survival rates. Those that improvised often paid the price. Training manuals were updated, and veterans who had operated Fireflies passed their hard-earned knowledge down to replacements. Stories circulated of times when a single accurate Firefly shot halted an entire German advance long enough for infantry to dig in. These anecdotes became doctrine. Keep the Firefly alive, and you keep your maneuver options open. By autumn 1944, a new armored choreography had matured across Allied formations. It was no longer sufficient to outnumber the enemy. Commanders had to outthink him, to shape the battlefield so that range and timing favored their strengths. The Firefly did not win wars by itself. It changed how battles were fought. It forced a strategic appreciation that armor without doctrine was merely heavy metal, and that a single adapted gun, correctly employed, could ripple through the hierarchy of tactics and logistics to produce strategic effects far greater than its numbers suggested. The first reports that reached German headquarters were met with disbelief. Panzer commanders who had spent years regarding Allied armor with casual contempt now described engagements that made no sense. Panthers were being destroyed from well beyond the effective range of the Sherman's 75mm gun. Tigers that had advanced confidently into open fields were burning before they could even fire. At first, analysts dismissed these accounts as exaggeration or battlefield confusion. But as the weeks passed, the same story arrived from every front in Normandy. Something new was killing their tanks. Frontline tank crews noticed it first. In letters home and after-action logs, they began mentioning the long-barreled Shermans. Some thought they were seeing new American designs. Others speculated that the British had mounted captured German guns. A Panther commander from the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote that his unit had lost 2 tanks in a single exchange to a Sherman that fired farther and truer than physics should allow. Investigators recovered fragments of shell casing from the wrecks and realized that the projectile was not German. It was British. The discovery alarmed everyone from regimental staff to Berlin. Orders went out to gather intelligence on this new weapon. Field agents interviewed survivors, measured impact craters, and examined disabled vehicles. The evidence was impossible to ignore. The holes punched through Panther armor were clean and smooth, entry points consistent with a high-velocity round far beyond what the 75mm Sherman could produce. Metallurgical tests confirmed penetration at angles previously thought impossible. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Allies had introduced a gun that matched or exceeded the vaunted German 88. The reaction inside Panzer units shifted from skepticism to unease. Crew briefings now included warnings any Sherman with an unusually long barrel should be engaged first. Snipers were ordered to target its commander's hatch the moment it appeared above a hedgerow. Artillery observers were instructed to call in fire missions at the first sighting. Captured prisoners were questioned relentlessly about this mysterious version of the Sherman. Most knew nothing. Many had never even seen one. The secrecy surrounding the Firefly was still working exactly as intended. Within weeks, German field manuals were amended. Tankers were reminded that Allied gunnery was improving, that range could no longer be assumed as an advantage. Platoon tactics changed subtly. Tanks advanced at wider intervals to reduce the chance of multiple losses from a single hidden gunner. Smoke rounds were used more frequently to obscure withdrawal routes. The confidence that had once characterized German armored doctrine began to erode. Accounts from the front revealed the psychological toll. A Tiger gunner from the 2nd Panzer Division wrote, "It is strange to fear a Sherman." He described an encounter near Cannes where his platoon halted upon seeing 3 Shermans in the distance. Convinced that one of them might be a Firefly, they waited for reinforcements rather than attack. The delay cost them the initiative and, ultimately, the position. Fear of a single enemy tank had paralyzed an entire company. At higher levels of command, the intelligence reports produced frustration and disbelief. In Berlin, engineers from Henschel and Krupp examined the data and concluded that the new British gun must be a variant of their own 88mm technology. Some even suggested that the Allies had copied German designs. The irony was painful. The innovation that now threatened their dominance was entirely their own in concept, improved and refined by their opponents. By late July, the German command began issuing explicit countermeasures. Camouflage patterns on Panthers and Tigers were altered to include additional disruptive striping to break up their shape against distant observers. Units were instructed to engage from cover whenever possible to avoid exposing frontal armor at long range. The age of the confident armored charge was ending. Firefly crews did not need to win every duel. They only had to make the Germans hesitate. Captured German officers interrogated after the fall of Caen described their shock. One major admitted that his men had underestimated British innovation. "We thought they could only copy," he said, "but they have surprised us. They have built something clever from our enemy's steel." His comment reflected a growing realization across the Wehrmacht. The Allies were learning, adapting faster than the Germans could respond. In September, German propaganda still claimed that the Tiger remained invincible, but soldiers at the front knew better. Rumors spread faster than official bulletins. Crews spoke in hushed tones of comrades killed by single shots from unseen tanks. Every unexplained explosion became evidence of the long-barreled Sherman. Fear turned myth into reality. The Firefly's legend grew larger than its actual numbers. In truth, only a small fraction of Allied tanks in Normandy were Fireflies. Yet their impact on morale was disproportionate. Each success echoed through both armies, reshaping perception as effectively as any strategic victory. The Firefly proved that technological surprise could achieve what brute force could not. It could undermine the enemy's faith in his own superiority. By autumn, German divisions retreating through France carried more than physical losses. They carried doubt. The men who once laughed at the Sherman no longer mocked it. They scanned every distant rise and hedgerow, searching for the silhouette of a gun barrel that seemed impossibly long. And when they found it, they no longer advanced. They waited, unsure if the next flash of light would mark the end of their tank, their crew, or the myth of invincibility they had believed in for far too long. For months, German engineers had prided themselves on the science of their superiority. To them, armored warfare was not a matter of numbers but of precision, of metallurgy, ballistics, and design elegance. Yet the weapon that now threatened them had been born not from theory, but from necessity. The Firefly's power lay in its gun, and that gun, the British 17-pounder, represented a triumph of pragmatic engineering over complexity. The 17-pounder was the culmination of years of British ordnance development, a weapon originally conceived for towed anti-tank units. From the moment it entered testing, its velocity impressed even the skeptics. Firing an armor-piercing round weighing nearly 8 kilograms, the gun produced a muzzle velocity of more than 2,900 feet per second. At that speed, the projectile carried immense kinetic energy, able to punch through 5 inches of hardened steel, even at long ranges. When fired from the stabilized platform of the Sherman's hull, its accuracy became lethal. A closer look at its ammunition revealed why the Firefly's shots seemed to ignore armor thickness altogether. The standard round, designated APCBC, armor-piercing, capped, ballistic capped, combined brute penetration with aerodynamic efficiency. Its hard steel core bit into armor, while the ballistic cap maintained velocity over distance. But the true innovation came with the APDS, or armor-piercing discarding sabot. This round used a smaller tungsten core held inside a lightweight shell casing. Upon leaving the barrel, the casing split apart, freeing the dense core to continue at incredible speed. It was a concept ahead of its time, essentially the forerunner of modern tank ammunition, and it allowed the Firefly to strike through targets previously thought untouchable. On paper, the numbers told a story of quiet revolution. At 500 yards, the 17-pounder could pierce 140 millimeters of armor angled at 30 degrees. At 1,000, it still retained more than enough force to destroy a Panther frontally. Even at 2,000 yards, a range considered extreme in tank combat, it could penetrate the side armor of a Tiger 1. To the German tanker accustomed to dictating the engagement distance, this was disorienting. The advantage of range had always been theirs. Now it belonged to the enemy. The gun's power came at a cost. Its recoil was brutal, nearly twice that of the original 75mm Sherman weapon. The interior space of the turret was consumed by the enormous breech, forcing the loader to operate in conditions so tight that bruised shoulders and scraped knuckles became routine. Every shot echoed through the hull like a hammer blow, rattling bolts and shaking teeth. Gunners complained that their ears rang for hours after combat, yet none would have traded back to the old gun. They finally had something that could fight back. German engineers studied captured Fireflies whenever they could, measuring angles, inspecting breech design, and weighing shells. Their reports admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that the 17-pounder's performance equaled the long-barreled 88mm KWK-43 mounted on the Tiger II. The difference was efficiency. The British gun achieved comparable results with a simpler mechanism and easier production methods. What the Germans viewed as crude improvisation turned out to be industrial genius. It could be built quickly, maintained easily, and installed on an existing chassis without redesigning an entire vehicle. The comparison between the Firefly and the German heavy tanks illustrated the divergence of two philosophies. The Tiger and Panther embodied over-engineering, machines designed for perfection at the expense of practicality. Each was a masterpiece on paper, but a logistical nightmare in the field, consuming vast amounts of fuel, spare parts, and time. The Sherman, by contrast, was a tool built for war's realities. It sacrificed luxury for reliability, and when fitted with the 17-pounder, it combined dependability with lethality in a way the Germans had never anticipated. Even beyond raw power, the Firefly's gun demonstrated an overlooked advantage: rate of first-round accuracy. Allied testing after the war found that trained Firefly gunners hit their targets with their first shot more often than their German counterparts. The reason was subtle but crucial. The Firefly's optical sight, though simpler, provided a clearer image under the overcast conditions typical of Northern Europe. Its range markings were intuitive, and its elevation controls smoother. German optics were precise but delicate. Dust, humidity, or a single crack could render them useless. In the mud and chaos of Normandy, practicality proved deadlier than perfection. The Firefly's crew procedures reflected that practicality. Commanders learned to coordinate their first shot to maximum effect, often waiting in silence while the enemy advanced into a pre-measured killing zone. When the rangefinder confirmed the distance, the order came quietly: on target, fire. The result was almost always the same: a single flash, a plume of smoke, and an armored silhouette collapsing in flame. One German observer wrote later that facing the Firefly felt like walking into an ambush laid by mathematics. The psychological impact of such precision cannot be overstated. German crews who once opened fire at extreme range found themselves second-guessing every movement. They no longer trusted the assumption that a Sherman could be ignored until it was within a kilometer. The battlefield, once governed by their superior optics and penetration charts, had become unpredictable. The irony of the Firefly's superiority lay in how unremarkable it appeared. There was no new engine, no revolutionary armor. It still caught fire when hit. It still groaned up muddy hills like every other Sherman. Yet the long barrel transformed it into something else: a weapon of balance, the meeting point between Allied pragmatism and German precision. It proved that in war, innovation need not mean reinvention. Sometimes it means the courage to improve what already exists. When British analysts compared kill statistics after the Normandy campaign, they discovered that fireflies accounted for a disproportionate number of enemy tank losses relative to their small share of total vehicles. The mathematics were clear. Fewer fireflies produced more results. The weapon's technical strengths had altered the equation of battle. The Tiger was still a formidable foe, but for the first time it faced an equal. For the Germans, the realization was devastating. Their carefully engineered supremacy had been undone not by a larger army or greater resources, but by a handful of mechanics who refused to accept the limits of a flawed design. The Firefly's 17-pounder had become the great equalizer, a silent declaration that the age of German invulnerability was over. Behind every Firefly stood a crew of 5 men who lived and breathed inside that steel box. They were young, usually in their early 20s, but carried the eyes of older men. The world they inhabited was a furnace of sound and heat, the rhythmic pounding of the engine, the deafening crack of the 17-pounder, and the claustrophobic stench of oil, cordite, and sweat. They were not just tankers. They were brothers, welded together by danger and necessity. For many, their first battle with the Firefly became a moment burned forever into memory. Corporal Peter Wiley of the 13th 18th Royal Hussars described it later. "We had spent months being hunted. Suddenly, we were the hunters. The sound of that gun was like vengeance itself." His Firefly had taken position behind a hedgerow near Tilly-sur-Seulles, lying in wait as German armor advanced along a narrow road. When the first Panther came into view, Wiley's gunner whispered, "Range, 1,100 yards." The shot struck true. "It didn't just stop," he wrote. "It came apart." That single moment changed everything for his crew. The fear that had haunted them through Tunisia and Italy lifted. They no longer spoke about surviving the war. They began to believe they might win it. In another report, Canadian Lieutenant John Bishop recalled his first engagement north of Caen. His troop had been pinned down by 2 Panthers firing from a tree line. The Shermans in his unit could not penetrate them, and several had already been lost. Bishop's Firefly maneuvered through an orchard, positioning at an angle where the Germans least expected it. "I remember the silence before the shot," he wrote. "Just the clicking of the breech and the smell of dust." His gunner, Sergeant McNair, fired once. The round entered the Panther's side and detonated inside the hull. The second tank turned to withdraw, but McNair fired again. 2 burning wrecks marked the end of the ambush. That night, Bishop continued, we realized the war had changed for us. For once, they were the ones running. Such stories spread quickly across Allied ranks. Tankers spoke of the Firefly as if it had a will of its own. It was temperamental, difficult to steer, and exhausting to load. Yet when it fired, it delivered a kind of poetic justice. Every crew that had lost friends in earlier campaigns felt that satisfaction in their bones. The laughter of the German gunners still echoed in memory, but now it was joined by a new sound, the Firefly's roar cutting through the fields of France. Not every story ended in triumph. The Firefly was deadly at range but fragile up close. Its thin armor offered little protection against German shells or anti-tank weapons. One misplaced shot or delayed order could turn victory into tragedy. Sergeant Alan Reeves of the 24th Lancers wrote in his diary about an engagement near the village of Hill 112. His Firefly had destroyed 2 Panthers before being spotted. The first hit struck the turret ring, he wrote. It jammed the traverse. We couldn't turn the gun. The second hit came seconds later. Reeves was the only survivor, pulled from the wreckage by infantry after the fire subsided. He never forgot the smell of burning paint and the sound of his friends' voices fading behind him. Loss and victory became constant companions. Firefly crews learned to live in the space between them, knowing that any battle could be their last. They coped with humor, superstition, and small rituals. Some painted names or slogans on their turrets. Killer Queen, Morning Star, the Long Arm. Others carried lucky charms from home, a photograph, a silver coin, a faded letter. Before each mission, they touched these tokens silently, a gesture that made them feel, if only for a moment, that fate could still be bargained with. Letters sent back to England and Canada tell of exhaustion and pride in equal measure. One commander wrote to his wife, "We have something that works now. You can't imagine what it's like to fire and watch the thing that terrified you burst into flame instead." Another told his father, "This gun, this firefly, it gives us a chance to look them in the eye." Their words, though restrained, carried a quiet intensity that spoke of redemption. Civilians who watched the battles unfold had their own impressions. Farmers in Normandy recalled the sight of tanks hidden in orchards, the ground trembling before the sound of the gun reached them. After each fight, they emerged from cellars to find twisted hulks of steel littering their fields. Among them, the long-barreled Shermans stood silently, their crews smoking cigarettes beside them, too drained to speak. The Firefly, though a machine of destruction, also became a symbol of liberation. Wherever it appeared, the German occupation began to crack. Captured German tankers later described what it felt like to face one. A Panther commander, taken prisoner near Falaise, said simply, "We feared the ones with the long gun." He explained that his unit had been taught to prioritize fireflies as targets. It was strange, he admitted, to fear a Sherman. But when that flash came from the hedges, it was already too late. For Allied crews, those words were the ultimate vindication. The men who had once been mocked now commanded respect, even from their enemies. They had turned a symbol of vulnerability into a weapon of terror. As the campaign in France wore on, the relationship between crew and tank grew deeply personal. Many wrote about their fireflies as if they were living beings. They spoke to them before battle, cursed them when engines stalled, and thanked them after each close escape. In their letters, tanks became companions, stubborn, loyal, and mortal. One gunner, Private George Kerr, ended his letter home with a single line: "She's ugly, she's loud, and she saves my life every day." By autumn of 1944, as Allied forces advanced toward Belgium, Fireflies had earned a reputation that extended beyond their firepower. They represented the turning tide of the war, proof that Allied industry and ingenuity could overcome even the most feared enemy. The crews who manned them had paid dearly for that lesson, but in their eyes, it was worth the cost. They no longer drove targets. They drove equals. The laughter of German gunners had fallen silent, replaced by the distant, steady thunder of the Firefly's gun echoing across the fields of Europe. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Firefly was no longer a curiosity or an experimental weapon. It had become a cornerstone of Allied armored operations. What began as a desperate improvisation by British engineers was now changing the way the Western Allies fought. In every division where Fireflies appeared, commanders began to think differently, not only about tactics, but about the entire philosophy of armored warfare. Before the Firefly, Allied armored doctrine had been defined by numbers and mobility. The idea was simple: overwhelm German positions through superior production, use air power and artillery to blunt enemy armor, and let the Shermans finish the job. But Normandy shattered that confidence. The losses suffered in the hedgerows made it clear that courage and quantity could not replace killing power. Crews learned that bravery alone could not stop an 88mm shell. The arrival of the Firefly shifted that logic. For the first time, Allied commanders could deploy tanks capable of dueling with Germany's best and surviving. In practical terms, this changed the tempo of operations. Fireflies allowed the Allies to attack with greater freedom. Instead of relying entirely on airstrikes or massed artillery to eliminate enemy armor, tank units could now handle threats on their own. This independence made combined arms coordination more fluid. Fireflies could hold ground until reinforcements arrived, giving infantry and engineers time to maneuver. In counterattack scenarios, their long reach disrupted German formations before they could build momentum. Strategically, their presence began to erode the confidence of the Panzer divisions. German units that had once relied on the shock of their heavy tanks found themselves facing opponents who were no longer intimidated. Allied reports noted that the appearance of a single Firefly in a formation often caused German armor to halt and reassess before attacking. The psychological weight of that hesitation mattered as much as the physical damage inflicted. A moment's pause on the battlefield could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Senior Allied commanders recognized this shift. Field Marshal Montgomery's staff highlighted Firefly-equipped troops in their operational planning. They were assigned to crucial sectors, used as spearheads in armored thrusts, or as sentinels in defensive lines. The Canadian 4th Armored Division's success near Falaise, where Fireflies helped encircle retreating German forces, demonstrated the power of combining precision fire with mobility. In battle summaries circulated among British and Canadian headquarters, the phrase Firefly effect began to appear, shorthand for engagements where the presence of the 17-pounder tipped the balance. The ripple extended beyond morale. The Firefly's success convinced Allied planners to invest more heavily in upgunned armor across the board. The Americans, initially skeptical, accelerated development of their own high-velocity guns, leading to the widespread deployment of the 76mm Sherman and the 90mm armed M36 tank destroyer. The British continued refining their 17-pounder designs, testing new ammunition and mounting variants on other vehicles, including the Challenger and Comet. The race to improve firepower had begun in earnest. At the same time, German industry was falling apart. Strategic bombing crippled production lines, and the loss of critical raw materials slowed replacement rates. For every Tiger built, the Allies fielded dozens of Shermans, and among them, an increasing number of Fireflies. Quantity was finally meeting quality. By late summer of 1944, the Allies enjoyed not only numerical superiority, but also a growing technological edge. The war of attrition that Germany had once hoped to avoid was now fully against them. Captured documents from retreating German formations reveal how deeply the Firefly had altered their perception of the Allied threat. Reports described engagements where advancing German columns halted upon spotting a Sherman at long range, unsure whether it was a harmless 75mm or a deadly 17-pounder. That uncertainty disrupted their tempo, forcing cautious maneuvers where aggression had once reigned. Every shadow of a long barrel became a ghost in the German mind, a phantom threat that compelled hesitation and cost them the initiative. The impact was not confined to the battlefield. On the home front, British newspapers began mentioning a new long-range tank that was taking the fight to the enemy. Though details were sparse, the tone had shifted from anxious to confident. Civilians who had endured years of grim headlines finally had something to celebrate. For the families of tank crews, the Firefly became a symbol of hope, proof that their sons now had a weapon worthy of their courage. In strategic meetings across Allied headquarters, discussions turned to the future of armored warfare. Generals who once dismissed the idea of modifying existing tanks now saw its value. The Firefly had proven that adaptation could rival innovation. Instead of waiting for entirely new designs to reach the front, existing vehicles could be upgraded quickly to meet new threats. This philosophy of rapid modification would echo through post-war doctrine for decades to come. As autumn turned to winter, the Firefly's role continued to expand. It was no longer just a tank killer. It was a force multiplier, a weapon that allowed ordinary units to achieve extraordinary results. Wherever Fireflies fought, the landscape of battle changed. German armor no longer advanced with confidence. It advanced with caution. Allied troops no longer braced for slaughter. They advanced knowing that somewhere behind them, hidden among the trees or the rubble, A firefly was watching. The laughter that had once defined the German view of the Sherman had long since faded. In its place came silence, the wary silence of men who had learned respect the hard way. By September 1944, the road to Paris was lined with the wrecks of German armor. Blackened hulks of tigers and panthers littered the countryside, their once feared silhouettes now reduced to twisted steel. The advance had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. German tank commanders who had once rolled confidently across Europe were now fighting in retreat, ambushed in places where they had once been the masters of ambush. And at the center of this transformation stood the Firefly, a machine that had turned the balance of fear upside down. In the weeks following the breakout from Normandy, Allied armored columns pressed relentlessly eastward. Town after town fell to the advancing forces, and in every engagement, Fireflies played a decisive role. Their range and accuracy allowed them to dominate the open plains where German armor once ruled. The fields that had favored the long barrels of the Panther now worked against them. Firefly crews learned to exploit that familiar arrogance, waiting just beyond visibility, hidden behind hedges or buildings, their guns trained on likely routes of withdrawal. When the Panthers appeared, sleek and confident, the Fireflies fired first. One British unit recorded an ambush near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, where a troop of Fireflies engaged 5 Panthers crossing an open valley. The gunners had set their ranges earlier using landmarks: a tree line, a ruined barn, a half-buried fence post. When the enemy tanks came into view, the Fireflies opened fire in perfect unison. 3 shots, 3 kills. The remaining 2 Panthers retreated into smoke, their commanders realizing too late that they were walking into a firing range. The after-action report simply stated, "All targets destroyed. No friendly casualties." The same pattern repeated across France and Belgium. The Panther's frontal armor, once the pride of German engineering, proved no defense against the velocity of the 17-pounder. Even the mighty Tiger Eye was no longer safe. A single Firefly positioned correctly could dominate an entire sector, forcing enemy armor to reroute or risk destruction. German tactics, once built around concentrated armored thrusts, devolved into small, cautious movements. The initiative had shifted permanently. What unnerved German crews most was not just the Firefly's power, but its invisibility. The weapon that had been mocked for its length became the master of concealment. Skilled crews used the terrain with surgical precision. They hid behind rubble and destroyed villages, between orchard rows or inside bomb craters, waiting patiently for the glint of a German cupola or the outline of a turret. When they fired, their first round was usually their last, not because of ammunition shortage, but because that single shot ended the engagement. Then, before enemy artillery could answer, the Firefly moved again, fading into another position. German radio intercepts from the period tell a story of growing panic. Engaged by long-gun Shermans at 1,500 meters, cannot advance. Panther destroyed by unknown gun, flank penetration. Enemy tanks firing from extreme range, retreating to secondary line. The reports piled up faster than a high command could process them. The psychological shift was complete. Allied crews, meanwhile, developed a sense of quiet confidence that bordered on disbelief. For years, they had been told that the German tanks were untouchable, their armor impenetrable. Now they saw those same machines burning through their own gun sights. The feeling was not triumph exactly, more like vindication. They were no longer underdogs. One of the most striking examples came during the liberation of Belgium. Outside the village of Rotselaar, a troop from the 1st Polish Armored Division took position along a wooded ridge. When a column of German tanks attempted to withdraw through the valley below, the Firefly commander held his fire until the last vehicle was exposed. Then, in a calm, steady voice, he ordered the shot. The first round destroyed the lead Panther. The second crippled the one behind it. The rest of the German column was trapped, boxed in by wreckage. In less than 5 minutes, the Fireflies had turned an orderly retreat into a massacre. For German crews, every encounter became a game of nerves. The question was no longer if the enemy could kill them, but where the killing shot would come from. Even when the Firefly wasn't there, its reputation was. Tankers fired at shadows, wasted ammunition on decoys, and withdrew from positions that might have been safe. The myth of the invincible Panther had dissolved into smoke. German engineers tried to answer. They fielded new types of armor skirts, reinforced mantlets, and improved ammunition. But these measures arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. Production delays, fuel shortages, and relentless Allied air raids crippled their ability to respond effectively. The Firefly did not need to destroy every Panther. It only needed to destroy the illusion of their superiority. By the time Allied forces crossed into the Low Countries, the Germans had lost more than 1,000 armored vehicles in just 3 months. Many of those kills were credited to Fireflies or their 17-pounder brethren. The British and Canadian units began to keep informal tallies, painting small silhouettes of enemy tanks on their barrels as tokens of pride. Yet even among these victories, crews spoke quietly of their fallen comrades. For every Firefly that survived, another had been lost to mines, ambushes, or a lucky shot from a concealed German gun. The Firefly's power came with no guarantee of safety. Its armor was still thin, its open stowage dangerous. Its gun might win the duel, but it could not shield the crew from shrapnel or flames. They knew this with every round fired. And yet, when the call came, they advanced without hesitation. Because now, finally, they had a weapon that could strike first. By the end of the autumn campaign, the tables of armored warfare in Western Europe had turned. The Firefly, born from desperation and ridicule, had forced the German war machine onto the defensive. The invincible had become vulnerable, and the predators of the battlefield had become prey. The autumn rains came early that year, turning the fields of Belgium into endless mud. Convoys bogged down, engines strained, and tempers flared. Yet amid the exhaustion of the long advance, the Fireflies kept moving. Their treads clawed through the sludge, their engines roaring against the wind, the long barrels pointing east, always east. For months they had fought from hedge to hedge, field to field, and now they were pushing toward the heart of Germany itself. In every army group, the Firefly had become a familiar sight. Once a secret weapon, it now led armored patrols through occupied towns and countryside. Its crews, hardened by the summer's battles, operated with quiet professionalism. They no longer marveled at their gun's power. They trusted it like an old friend. When infantry units advanced under fire, Fireflies waited behind hedgerows or ruined walls, scanning for the shimmer of German armor in the rain. When a tiger or panther appeared, they engaged with mechanical precision. No shouting, no panic, just the crisp commands of men who knew exactly what to do. In the Netherlands, where canals and open fields offered long sight lines, the Firefly came into its own. Near Eindhoven, a troop from the British Guards Armored Division used their range advantage to devastating effect. German tanks attempting to cross a causeway were spotted at over a mile's distance. The Fireflies opened fire before the enemy even realized they were being watched. 3 shells, 3 hits, and the crossing was blocked. When infantry moved forward hours later, they found the German tanks still smoldering, their crews gone or surrendered. Canadian formations fought similar battles across northern Holland, supporting the liberation of towns along the Maas River. In the flat terrain, their gunners could see for miles, and their shots carried with uncanny accuracy. A Canadian officer later wrote, "The Firefly was our sniper. We did not move without it." Its presence turned the open plains, once the preferred ground of the German Panzer divisions, into killing zones controlled by Allied guns. But the fighting was far from easy. For every German tank destroyed, another appeared somewhere else. The retreating enemy fought with desperation, often from ambush. Panzerfaust teams lurked in barns and basements, waiting to strike as tanks passed through villages. The Firefly's long gun, a blessing in open country, became a liability in the narrow streets of Holland's towns. Its barrel caught on walls and lamp posts, forcing drivers to maneuver slowly, cautiously. Every corner could hide death. To counter these dangers, Firefly crews adapted again. They learned to fight in pairs, one covering while the other advanced. Infantry followed close behind, sweeping windows and alleys for anti-tank teams. It was dirty, close-quarters work, a kind of urban warfare the Firefly had never been designed for. Yet it endured, and it prevailed. By winter, the Firefly had crossed into Germany. The air was colder, the sky always gray, and the roads were clogged with refugees fleeing the advancing armies. The Fireflies moved among them, hulking beasts of liberation, their long barrels wrapped in canvas against the frost. In many villages, they were the first Allied tanks the civilians had ever seen. To those who had lived under occupation for years, the sight was both terrifying and wondrous. The machine that could kill the Tiger had come to free them. Inside the Firefly's turret, the mood was different. The crews had grown weary, older than their years. They had seen too much, too many burned-out hulks, too many comrades left behind in smoking wrecks. The exhilaration of early victories had given way to a grim professionalism. They no longer counted their kills or celebrated their successes. Each day was another step toward the end, and each mile deeper into Germany carried the same thought: let this be the last one. Still, they fought on. In the forests of the Reichswald, Fireflies blasted bunkers and anti-tank positions with high explosive rounds. In towns like Kleve and Goch, they supported infantry house by house, using their main gun to shatter walls hiding machine gun nests. Their long barrels, once symbols of pure anti-tank power, had become tools of destruction against anything that stood in the path of the Allied advance. The Firefly's reputation grew even among the enemy. Captured German officers often asked to see the gun up close. Some touched the barrel, running their hands along the cold steel as if to understand how something so simple could have undone their armored legions. One prisoner was overheard muttering, "If we had built like this, perhaps the war would have gone differently." By early 1945, the Firefly was more than a tank. It had become a symbol of Allied resolve, a statement that ingenuity and adaptation could overcome arrogance and design. It wasn't the heaviest or fastest machine on the field, but it was the right one at the right time. It stood for everything that had turned the tide: collaboration between nations, learning from failure, and the courage of men who refused to accept defeat. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March, Fireflies were among the first to roll across the bridges under enemy fire. Their tracks clanged against the steel decking as artillery exploded around them. German resistance was fierce but scattered. Those few tanks that dared to challenge the crossing were met with the same bright flash that had haunted them since Normandy. One by one, they fell. As Germany collapsed, the Firefly's role began to change. It was no longer just a weapon of necessity. It had become an icon of victory. Crews decorated their tanks with chalk inscriptions: Berlin or Boost, V for victory, the long reach. They knew the end was near, but they also understood that this machine, forged in desperation, had carried them all the way from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of the Reich. When spring finally came, the Fireflies stood parked among the ruins of German cities. Their engines cooled, their barrels blackened from hundreds of rounds fired. Around them, the silence of peace began to settle, uneasy, fragile, but real. For the men who had lived inside them, The quiet was almost unbearable. They stepped down from their turrets, touching the cold steel one last time, knowing that their war was over. The machine that had once been born from ridicule had ended as the instrument of redemption. As the guns of Western Europe fell silent in the spring of 1945, two tanks stood as the defining symbols of Allied armor: the British Sherman Firefly and the American M36 Jackson. Both had emerged from the same desperation: the need to defeat German heavy tanks that had dominated the battlefield since 1942. Yet their paths to creation revealed two different philosophies, two distinct reflections of their nation's character and approach to war. The Firefly was a story of adaptation, a British reimagining of an American machine, stripped down and rearmed to deliver power far beyond its size. It had been built in workshops that smelled of oil and improvisation, its design dictated by men who could not afford to wait for perfection. The M36, by contrast, was born from American industrial order, a weapon conceived through formal doctrine, tested at proving grounds, and manufactured in the controlled rhythm of mass production. Both were responses to the same problem, but they spoke different languages. In the American approach to armored warfare, mobility and flexibility had always been prized above all. The U.S. Army's early doctrine separated the roles of tanks and tank destroyers. Tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs and support infantry. Tank destroyers were the hunters, fast and lightly armored, designed to intercept and annihilate enemy armor. The M36 embodied that doctrine. Built on the reliable chassis of the M10, it carried the new 90mm gun, a weapon of extraordinary velocity and precision, adapted from anti-aircraft designs much like the Firefly's 17-pounder. Its turret was open-top to save weight and improve visibility, sacrificing protection for speed and awareness. Where the Firefly crept forward cautiously, using camouflage and concealment, the M36 moved with aggression, striking swiftly and retreating before the enemy could respond. Its crews were trained to fight as ambushers, to appear where least expected, fire once or twice and vanish. In open terrain, the two tanks performed almost identically in terms of lethality. The 90mm gun could destroy a Panther or Tiger frontally at well over 1,500 meters. The 17-pounder achieved similar results, sometimes even greater at distance, depending on ammunition type. The difference lay in how each nation used them. British armored commanders wove their Fireflies into the fabric of regular tank units, integrating them into combined platoons of Shermans. They believed that unity of purpose mattered more than strict specialization. The Firefly was both tank and tank destroyer, serving as protector and avenger within the same formation. To its crews, this balance felt natural. They had fought too long without adequate firepower to give up the chance to stand alongside their fellow tankers. The Americans kept their lines more rigid. The M36 belonged to the tank destroyer battalions, units with their own command structure and doctrine. They were attached to divisions as needed, rushing to threatened sectors, then withdrawing when the tide shifted. Their identity was independent, almost insurgent, a mobile reserve that embodied the American belief in initiative and maneuver. The Firefly symbolized endurance. The M36 represented momentum. Despite these differences, their crews shared the same experience: the raw satisfaction of facing German armor on equal terms. Reports from both sides of the channel describe remarkably similar emotions. An American M36 gunner near Aachen wrote, "It felt like cheating to finally see a tiger and not have to run." A British Firefly commander in Holland said, "For the first time, we could look them in the eye." Both sentences carried the same relief, the same exhaustion, and the same quiet pride. Technically, the Firefly's 17-pounder and the M36's 90mm were almost twins in performance. Each fired roughly similar projectiles at near identical velocities. Each could penetrate the Panther's front armor at ranges that defied wartime expectations. Both used tungsten-cored ammunition that, when available, transformed them into precision instruments of destruction. The differences were marginal, measured in millimeters of armor penetration, degrees of accuracy, or the recoil's jolt against a gunner's shoulder. On the battlefield, those margins meant nothing. What mattered was that both guns gave Allied crews the power they had long been denied. In the chaos of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, M36s and Fireflies often found themselves operating side by side. American tank destroyer units and British armored regiments defended the same villages, sometimes within shouting distance of one another. At night, when the guns fell silent and engines cooled, their crews met over cups of coffee or tins of tea, comparing weapons and stories. They joked about whose gun hit harder or whose tank broke down less. Beneath the humor was mutual respect, an understanding that both machines had saved lives and shortened the war. As victory approached, the two designs came to represent more than national ingenuity. They embodied the Allied partnership itself, two nations with different methods working toward the same end. The Firefly had been made possible only through American production and British invention. The M36 had been inspired in part by the same lessons that birthed the Firefly. The Atlantic that separated the two allies had become a conduit of cooperation, a bridge of steel and powder. When the fighting finally ended, the world changed, but the legacy of those machines endured. The Firefly 17-pounder would influence post-war British designs, leading directly to the 20-pounder and eventually the 105mm L7, the gun that armed NATO tanks for decades. The American 990mm would evolve into larger calibers, shaping the weapons that faced the next generation of threats. Together, they defined the future of tank warfare not through radical invention, but through relentless refinement. In museums and memorials across Europe today, Fireflies and M36s still stand silent, their barrels pointed skyward. Children climb on their tracks. Veterans stand beside them in quiet reflection. The paint has faded, the steel has rusted, but the symbolism remains intact. They are monuments to a moment when engineering met courage, when adaptation triumphed over arrogance. For the Germans who once laughed at the Sherman, the Firefly and M36 were living proof of how quickly laughter could turn to fear. For the men who fought inside them, they were not simply machines. They were deliverance. The story of the Firefly ended not with explosions or glory, but with peace. It had done what it was built to do, restore balance to a battlefield that had long been one-sided. Its barrel, once stretched toward the distant enemies, now rests in silence among the fields it helped to free. The Firefly's final lesson was simple. In war, perfection is an illusion. What matters is the will to adapt, to learn faster than your enemy, and to believe that even the most ridiculed weapon can change the course of history when placed in the right hands.